and we hope that you find this an extremely informative, worthwhile webinar. And I would like just to say a big thank you to Lauren Bernardi and Richler from Bernardi HR Law. Thank you so much for taking the time to assist our businesses. This is a hot topic, and I think there's a lot of questions surrounding it. So thank you for addressing those. Big thanks to the town of Minto, the Minto Chamber of Commerce, and Launch It for providing us the tools and resources and funding to do this. So just quickly before we get started, some rules of engagement here. Because we have such a high demand for this webinar series, there's I think over 70 people going to be joining us on this call. We ask that you pre-submit questions to us prior, and a lot of the questions are duplicate and a lot are already going to be answered. But at the end, I have sent Lauren and Rob our questions. They will be addressing anything that isn't covered already. But should you think of something at a later time that has not been covered, or you're just questioning, feel free to email info@launchitminto.com, and we'll do our best to get you those answers as quickly as possible. So I think I'm just going to turn it right over to Lauren and Rob.
Thank you very much, Summer. I appreciate that. And good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us on an early Monday morning. So as Summer mentioned, it's a complicated topic, and it's certainly one where emotions are running very, very high right now. And there's lots of strong views and lots of concerns on all sides. And it is complicated. Now, we're employment lawyers, and we're here to really talk to you about it from a legal standpoint. We are not medical professionals. We can't really speak to vaccines themselves, but we're going to talk to you about some of the legal issues today. And we're going to talk about things like vaccine passports and policies that organizations can have, both for their customers and for their staff. So that's the goal today. And as Summer mentioned, we were given some of the questions ahead of time, which we should be able to address, but we have only an hour. And I know that that may not be as much time as everyone is hoping, but we'll give it our best shot. So first of all, where are we at right now? In Ontario, our latest statistics are about 85% of those who are eligible have received at least one dose, and over 79% of those who are eligible are fully vaccinated. So we're doing well, and we're getting there in our numbers. In terms of the Wellington, Dufferin, Guelph Health Unit, over 86% of those who are eligible have received at least one dose, and over 81.5% of those who are eligible are fully vaccinated. In Minto, that number is slightly lower. It is about 70 to 79%. So 70% fully vaccinated and 79% having at least one dose. In terms of the, sorry, I'm hearing a noise there, just was checking out. Okay, so the 7-day average for cases per 100,000 for those who are unvaccinated is about 10.9%. For those who are partially vaccinated, 6.3%, and fully, it's not percent, it's numbers, fully vaccinated, 1.71. So you can see when you look at the statistics, and they're changing every day, and it depends on what category you're looking at, but you will see that those numbers are relatively stable in terms of it's unvaccinated that are ending up with the more serious cases of COVID. They're the ones that are ending up in the hospital. So we're seeing that the vaccines work. There's efficacy around them. We've been looking at them around the world, and we're certainly seeing that happen. And, you know, we can have great PPEs and social distancing and all those things, but to really avoid the lockdowns, the government's determined that we need to have some passports and some mandatory categories. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob now. I'm the one that's changing the slides, so you'll hear Rob tell me when to change the slides.
Thanks, Lauren, and good morning, everyone. Thanks again for joining us at such an early time. So, as many of you, if not all of you know, the government recently introduced this new COVID-19 passport system, I'll call it. They call it an enhanced COVID-19 vaccine certificate system. And For the legalese on it, it was established by Section 2.1 of Schedule 1 of Ontario Regulation 364/20, which no one's ever going to remember or hear again. But it comes into effect in 2 days on September 22nd. And basically what it provides is that patrons have to provide proof of identification and proof of full vaccination in order to enter into certain businesses and organizations that have been identified as falling within the passport system. Now, it doesn't apply to your employees when they're coming to your site. So the government has said that businesses are able to establish whatever system they want to do for their own employees. The passport system only applies for patrons who are coming to your site. And the thing to know is, just because the government has said that this is what they require, they've also said that that's not the maximum that you can put in place. They've said that you have to at least follow this, but you can put in a stricter restriction if you want. So if you want to have it more than just this, you're able to do that as well. And also, it's important to know that this doesn't replace the requirements that are already in effect. So if you have to be taking the names of people and writing them down to do the other screenings that are already in place, if you're doing any other type of identification or screening, those are still in place. This is in addition, not above. So let's move on to the next slide. So what businesses are being affected by this? The list is coming up there. Some of the big highlights are restaurants, gyms, bars, bingo halls. So those are the type of things that are being established. And I see a question coming in. We'll hopefully get to that in a little bit. But in terms of these businesses, those are the ones that are going to be affected. And then it's also important to note that until October 13th, also indoor social gatherings for weddings and funerals, if you're having those, then you're going to have to also show a recent negative COVID-19 antigen test. It's not this proof of vaccination system. So let's move on to the next slide and talk about what businesses have to do in order to determine whether someone has had that vaccination and it does fulfill the requirements of this vaccination system, the proof system. So what do businesses have to do? They have to review and confirm proof of full vaccination before they let people in, before they permit entry. So when we say full vaccination, what do we mean? It's not just getting the 2 shots. It's actually getting the 2 shots, and that second one being at least 14 days prior to the date they're trying to access the location. So it's that 2-week period after you've gotten the second vaccine before the experts say that the vaccine is fully effective. So it's after that 2-week period has ended that you're allowed entry. And a lot of people don't realize that. There are some vaccines that only have a 1-shot system. I think the Johnson & Johnson one is the most famous one that was approved, at least conditionally in Ontario. So if you did do it through the Johnson & Johnson, whether here or elsewhere, and you only needed to have the 1 shot, then that is fine. It's whichever is the requirements for your particular set of vaccines that you were doing. Importantly, the businesses can't retain the information provided by a patron in accordance with this requirement. So showing that you got it those 14 days before, you can't write that down in your ledger like you would with people who you're letting in to know that it's okay for them to access the business or their screening that they did. You can't keep this information. That's one of the requirements of the law. And as I mentioned before, it doesn't apply to people coming to the business to work there, although you always could have them follow the same requirements if you wanted.
And we will be talking about the employee vaccine policy as well this morning.
Definitely. Thanks, Lauren. So let's look at what the types of things that you have to look into in a vaccine check are. So first off, where do you get these receipts? Anyone who's gotten a vaccine knows that you got a piece of paper at the time when you got the shot, but maybe at the time you said, you know what, I don't really need this, you tossed it out. So are you out of luck then? No. The government's actually set up a website at covid19.ontario.ca where you can download your vaccination receipts. You just go in, you put in, I believe, your health card number and your name and maybe some additional information, and it'll give you a copy of your 2 vaccination receipts. I did that. It's actually a very simple process to do. So once you do that, it'll look something like what we're seeing on the screen right now. And there's 4 key areas that we've highlighted. And the first is the name. So the name and date of birth will be on the vaccination receipt, and you have to check a piece of ID in order to make sure that it matches. And it doesn't have to be a piece of photo ID, but it has to be an official government ID. And then check if the receipt is from Ontario, and if not, check if it's registered on ontario.ca. And then you also have to make sure they're fully vaccinated. So did they get the 2 shots that they require, the one if it doesn't require to? And this may be the biggest one that people really have to think about. Did they get it 14 days prior to the attempted entry? So the name and date match, it's registered from Ontario or from elsewhere, they're fully vaxxed, and that fully vaxxed means that it was 14 days or more later. So what happens if you fail to comply? Well, let's look at the next slide. There's some potential fines. It's $750 for individuals and $1,000 for corporations. So if you don't put it in place, then you're not going to be able to, if you don't put it in place, then you may be subject to those fines. There are some exemptions, and there are some people who it doesn't apply to. So we talked about it on our next slide, which Lauren will switch to, which is it applies to everyone who's 12 or older, unless they do have a medical exemption, which prevents them from being able to do it. Now, interestingly, the government did not include religious exemptions. So we'll see if that comes up and how people will deal with it. But unless you have a medical exemption, it applies to everyone 12 or older. And if you do have a medical exemption, you have to show a medical note which sets out a documented reason for not being fully vaccinated and how long that applies. So if it's only a temporary one, then it has to say that. And if it's permanent, then it has to say that as well. And the government said that they're going to include in their enhanced digital app that's going to come out a way to include this medical information, but that's probably going to come at a later date. Going on to the next slide, the basic takeaway is if you're under or if you're over 12 and you don't have a medical exemption, if you don't show proof, then no access is permitted. There's no exemptions for it otherwise, and patrons are required to comply, and people who are coming are required to understand that that's what's going to happen. There are a few other exemptions. The biggest one tending to be that if you're a youth under the age of 18 who's going somewhere to participate in an indoor organized sport, like hockey in a rink, other sports leagues, dance classes, martial arts, swimming classes, you don't have to, as a youth under the age of 18, show the proof for those activities. But once you hit 18, even for those, you are required to do it. And then
just if I can add there, Rob, I think part of the idea is that the businesses or the types of activities that were selected were the ones that aren't seen as essential. And so that's why we're kind of drawing this little bit of a line in the sand. You'll be able to live your life. You'll be able to go to the grocery store and get medical care and all those other things. It's just those extras in life that they're placing those limits on.
Yeah, and I think for those sport leagues and things like that, for the people under 18, my reading into it is they're trying to keep as much as possible sort of life for kids as close to normal as they can. So that, I think, is why they put in those exemptions for kids. And then the government's also announced, and I'll show it on the next slide, that they're putting in an enhanced vaccine certificate and verification app. That's coming out October 22nd, 2021. This is my mock-up of what it's going to look like, so it likely will look different than that, but they're going to give you a QR code like this. And the app, my understanding is it's going to be able to scan the QR code, and then when it scans it, then people will be able to just quickly get notification, yes or no, this person's been vaccinated and they're eligible. It's likely you will also have to show your ID, but it may be that it's incorporated into it somehow. It may be sort of like a time limited code. There's lots of restaurants and stuff that do that with their QR code, so maybe that's the way the app will work. We're still waiting to find out exactly how it's going to work, and my understanding is the app will be able to scan and you'll be able to show your QR code. So we'll get some more information of that hopefully by October 22nd. That's the date the government said that we'll find out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to talk about mandating vaccines.
So for this section, we're going to talk about mandating the vaccines for employees. So as Rob already said, we know that the government didn't say that you have to mandate it for employees. You can, but it wasn't required. It would have been helpful if they'd given a little bit more guidance on that, because I know there's been a lot of questions that have been asked by employers about what they can and cannot do. The famous answer that lawyers always give whenever answered a question is it depends. And it always does depend. But by and large, I would say you do have that right. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as we move forward. You would just need to look at it kind of on a case-by-case basis. So if you are, a friend of mine runs an organization that is 100% virtual. Once the pandemic hit, they closed all of their offices and everyone's working from home. And it's going to be a while before they're ever back together, even for meetings. So to mandate vaccines for employees in that kind of situation doesn't really make sense. They're probably going to receive some pushback. And I think that they would struggle to be able to prove that it's necessary. But in other situations, when you can't have people social distancing, when you're serving the public, that may be a bit different. And so we will talk about it. It does seem an anomaly to have passports for customers that are coming into your organization, but then not your staff. I think it may be easier to just have kind of one approach with everyone rather than having it split up. But we are seeing that this is kind of spreading. So the federal government announced that for all federal employees, federally regulated employees, that they will have to be fully vaccinated. The same has also happened in the US. We're also seeing municipalities that are implementing vaccine mandates for staff and large employers, sporting venues. All of these things are starting to happen. And the more it happens, the more likely it is that a court or an arbitrator would uphold those vaccine mandates because they're seen as a collective necessity in order to overcome an extreme public health challenge, the likes of which we've not seen in our lifetimes. And the other thing to bear in mind is that employers have a responsibility under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to take every reasonable protection or precaution to protect their employees. And I'm going to talk about the human rights piece. I know that's something that people talk about. I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but we have this overarching duty to protect the health and safety of those that work for us. And when it comes, I'll just quickly say this, when it comes to human rights don't operate in a vacuum. So I may have a right, but I also have a responsibility not to cause harm to others. And so these rights all get kind of balanced out. And even within human rights law, health and safety is one of the things that gets looked at in terms of restricting what we might otherwise think of as our rights, our human rights under the Human Rights Code. So these are the overarching things that you need to consider when thinking about whether you do this on an employee basis. So Rob's now going to talk about the government mandated vaccine policies. And Rob, I'll get you set up on this one from the CMOH.
Sure. So before I actually go to the CMOH one, I want to touch quickly on what the feds have announced. So the feds have announced that and they announced this about a month ago on August 13th, so a little bit over a month ago, that they were going to make the federal public sector, all of the people working in it, and the federally regulated transportation sector have to have mandated vaccines by the end of October. So that's air, rail, marine transport, all those federally regulated organizations, they announced that they were going to have to be fully vaxxed by the end of October. They didn't yet say exactly how they're going to require that, but they've announced that it's going to be a requirement. And some of the airlines have started introducing policies, including Air Canada. And Air Canada actually has a very strict one, which says that everyone has to be vaccinated or else you're basically going to be put on an unpaid leave of absence. That's more strict than what some of the other organizations, for instance, the City of Toronto, have put in place, where they've said if you aren't vaccinated, then there's other things that we can do. And the feds have actually said that they expect other federally regulated employers to follow suit. So they really want everyone to do it. The provinces have also put in requirements for certain areas like schools. They announced recently what's going to be required, certain high-risk settings, and then the CMO regulations we'll look at on the next page. And that's what's being commonly referred to as Directive Number 6. And that's because that's what came out as. It was Directive Number 6 from the Chief Medical Officer of Health. And what that did was it made vaccination policies mandatory in certain high-risk settings by no later than September 7th. So this is already in force and has been for about 2 weeks. And those settings were public hospitals, long-term care homes, the local health integration networks, and ambulance services. And briefly, what it says is you have to be fully vaccinated by that date that it came into place. However, if you have a medical reason why you can't be vaccinated, then you can have that as an exemption, but you have certain requirements that are going to be in place. And if you don't have a medical exemption and you still don't want to be vaccinated, then you have to complete a COVID-19 vaccination education session. And after you finish that session, then if you still don't want to be vaccinated, then you can come back to work under certain restrictions. So like I said, where Canada said, get vaccinated or else you can't work, this is a lesser requirement. But what happens if you choose not to get vaccinated? Well, if you're not fully vaccinated, you have to undertake regular antigen testing. And we've seen employers who are doing this as often as 3 times a week for their employers who aren't vaccinated. And that's allowed under the requirement. And it doesn't say who has to pay for it. So it may be that if you decide you don't want to get vaccinated, then you're going to have to comply with this requirement and get vaccinated as often as your employer wants, potentially at your own cost. So that's sort of a way to push people towards getting vaccinated. We also have another new rule that came out from the government, and we talk about that on the next slide. And what they've said is that businesses must comply with CMOH advice, recommendations, or instructions requiring a vaccination policy. And this was actually another regulation that came out from the government. It came out on August 24th. So they changed the law. So where the law used to be silent on it, it actually now says that if you're a business and you live somewhere where the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health or a medical officer of health in your area has consulted with the CMO and makes a recommendation or gives advice or gives instructions about requiring a vaccination policy, then you have to comply with it. So that's actually a law. I saw a question before saying, well, it's not a law, do we have to comply with it? So this is actually a law through this regulation that you have to comply with CMOH advice, recommendations, and instructions. So has there been that type of instruction in Minto? Well, let's look at the next slide. So in fact, Dr. Matthew Tenenbaum, who's the Associate Medical Officer of Health, did put out a letter on September 1st that dealt with this exact issue. So Dr. Tenenbaum said, I'm writing to offer my strongest possible recommendation that all employers across Wellington County, Dufferin County, and Guelph introduce COVID-19 vaccination policies within their workplace. So you have a recommendation, his strongest possible recommendation in his words, that all employers introduce those. And when you read that with the regulation that we were talking about in the previous slide that says all businesses have to comply with recommendations by medical officer of health, that actually, when read together, suggests that you actually do, as an organization in Minto and the surrounding areas that are covered by this Office of Health, have to put in place a vaccination policy. And so, you know, similar letters have been issued in multiple other municipalities, including just offhand Toronto and Hamilton. So it's really starting to spread. And effectively, as we'll see on the next slide, it means that mandatory vaccination policies have to be, sorry, I actually jumped ahead, it's one slide, but that's okay. It means that you do have to put those in place. But what does that look like? Well, we'll talk up to Lauren about how those are going to look.
So thank you. I think to use that expression, I think the ship has sailed in many respects, that more employers are recognizing the importance of doing it. We needed a few leaders at the beginning to start doing it, and then people recognize that it's probably the thing that needs to happen at this point, regardless of our personal views on whether we think we should be doing. I got muted. At this point, it's something that we need to look at as employers. I'm getting a little message that says I'm muted. Can you hear me? Just wave, Rob, if you can hear. Okay, great. So now there, as Rob kind of alluded, there are different ways that you can do your mandatory vaccine policy. So there can be an outright, it's mandatory. And if you don't get it, at some point, there will be consequences. And you don't necessarily need to set out what those consequences are right away, because the consequences could depend on the particular situation. But we are seeing some organizations that are saying you'll be suspended without pay, or you will be outright terminated. So we'll see what happens with that. Others are doing it where it's a combination of education and testing. So we're going to send you to some education sessions. And if you don't then get vaccinated after that, we're going to do that thing that Rob talked about with more testing that is happening, more frequent testing. So that is kind of the way some of them are looking at it. I've seen some organizations where they're saying, you know, you're going to be suspended with pay if you don't agree, and we're going to send you to some education sessions. If you still don't get mandated or still don't get vaccinated, we'll send you to another education session, again with pay. But if you don't get vaccinated at that point, then you will be terminated. And I think there's a high likelihood that that approach would be upheld by a court or an arbitrator. And I think the one thing to be very careful about, we're calling them mandatory vaccine policies, but nobody's mandating that someone get vaccinated. No one's being, you know, put in a room and injected something that they don't want. These are the consequences to making the decision. Up to you to make the decision. And obviously there's exemptions, but if you make the decision not to get vaccinated, these are the consequences that flow from it. So we're not saying you have to get vaccinated. We're saying if you don't get vaccinated, this is what happens. And that's what the policies deal with, is what happens if you make that choice not to. And then in terms of what you include, you need to look at your particular situation. And we're going to walk you through some of those considerations in a moment in terms of the specifics of the policy. But you want to look at your workplace itself. What's the risk of transmission? I'm in a building for our offices where if we keep people coming in about 3 days a week, we can have everyone in an office with a closed door. So that makes it a different consideration than maybe if you have to have people who can't stay 6 feet apart, where you have different demographics. And noted here that the policies have not been legally tested and may eventually be challenged, but I think the likelihood of a challenge being successful is getting slimmer. Especially as more and more organizations are mandating. More and more organizations are mandating vaccines, and the government is, you know, gradually inserting policies as well. And we're seeing it across the country. Alberta and Saskatchewan have had some issues, and they're looking at these things as well. Okay, so let's talk about creating your vaccine policy. And Rob, back over to you.
Thanks, Lauren. So what are the types of things that we have to think about when creating a vaccine policy? There's a few key considerations that we'll talk about, and Lauren, if you can go to the next slide. So the first is the policy terms. So this is what we've sort of been alluding to. What are you going to say is required? Is it sort of the true vaccine mandate where you're saying get vaccinated or leave us? Is it the less restrictive in between one where you say you'll get a vaccination awareness course, regular testing. What are you as a business going to say you want to have? And right now, as we alluded to, there's no requirement to do it one way or another. The regulation that I talked about just says you have to have a policy. It doesn't say what that policy has to say. So maybe you say we're going to have people get screened by that regulation, by that app. And then once they've been screened and it's been shown that they have that vaccine passport pass, if you will, then we'll write it down and we don't have to check them again. Maybe you say, we're going to, even for fully vaccinated people, have them have that antigen testing once a week or twice a week, 3 times a week, whatever the company decides they want. You don't have to do it one way or another, and you can have it as strict or as lax as you want. Right now, there's no rules saying what it has to be as long as you have something in place. So you really want to look at what your organization has in its requirements and determine based on that how strict or lax you want it to be. So that's step one, determine what the policy terms are going to be. Then look at accommodation. So there's HR legislation, human rights legislation, which says you can't discriminate against someone for a protected reason. So the main ones that have been identified and seem to be acknowledged as being the types of discrimination that may be in place here are medical and religious exemptions from getting vaccinated. So if you have a medical condition which prevents you from being able to get vaccinated, you may not have to do it for that. Similarly, if you have a religious affiliation that the leaders have said we don't approve of vaccination and you follow that, that may apply as well. And really, for that, there's been a lot of suggestion that maybe people will just jump on to these out there religions that they haven't been part of previously. But it seems that you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to show that you have a long-standing affiliation with this faith through proof from a faith leader. And the assumption is that faith leaders aren't just going to write letters for people who are just deciding suddenly to join their religion to get out of vaccines.
So Rob, if I can add to that too, for those of you that are interested in the human rights implications, there was a document put out by the Ontario Human Rights Commission earlier this year about COVID in general and human rights issues. And when they talk about the exemption for religious belief, it has to be sincerely, freely, and deeply held. It has to be integrally linked to a person's identity, self-definition, and fulfillment, and be part of a particular and comprehensive overarching system of belief that governs one's conduct and practices, that addresses the ultimate question of human existence, including ideas about life, purpose, death, and the existence or non-existence of a creator or higher different order. And it must be connected in some way to an organization or community that professes a shared system or belief. This idea of a religious exemption has already been tested with respect to masks. And in those cases, they have said that the religious exemption that was put forward in that occasion was a singular belief, and it was more of a political belief about masks rather than a creed or religious belief. So both the disability and the religious accommodation pieces under human rights are very, very narrow. And when it comes to disability, the OMA has already written to doctors to make it clear that there are very few exemptions medically and that they should not be just writing these notes willy-nilly, and they'll need to specify whether this is a permanent accommodation or disability or whether it's something that may be temporary. So I thought I'd just throw that in there now, Rob.
No, that was perfect. And like Lauren said, those recent Human Rights Tribunal decisions said, in essence, that if it's a mere political opinion or a recognizable and not a recognizable cohesive belief system, then it's not going to fly. So people who are saying, I'm going to fight it and then go to the HRTO. There's already precedent there that says that they're not going to be successful. So that's unlikely to succeed in short. So the next key consideration is, what are the consequences for non-compliance? Again, there's no requirements under the law to deal with people in a certain way. So you as a business have to think about that, and how are you going to deal with it? So are you going to say they have to take the vaccine awareness course? Are you going to make them continue working remotely because they don't want to do it? If it's someone who's been doing that before, maybe you say, we'll wait to bring them back. They'll continue working remotely. Maybe you'll say, we're going to have them keep wearing PPE while we start to relax those requirements for others. You still, of course, have to comply with any requirements by the government in terms of PPE wear, but maybe if those start to become more lax where you work, and you let the people who are fully vaccinated not use it, you keep people who haven't been vaccinated wearing it as well, because that helps prevent against the spread. Regular antigen testing is another way. Unpaid leave or termination are all considerations. I said you can terminate, that's true. Likely you won't be able to say it's for cause because they've chosen not to get vaccinated, so you may have to do a payout, but that is a option. And then last is privacy considerations. It has to be minimally intrusive, and so you limit who has access to that information and only keep it as long as required. So you don't give it to everyone in the company, those records. Maybe you have a person in HR or health and safety who has those records, and maybe it's only once you've checked everything and you confirm that they're okay, you just say, yes, Rob it is cleared. Yes, Lauren's cleared. You don't keep all of the details about it. Keep it as minimally intrusive as possible. So what are the components of your vaccine policy? We'll move to the next slide. And we talked about some of the things that are in it, but basically you want to identify the scope and purpose first, then determine and list the action steps for the employees. So what do the employees have to do? Do they have to get fully vaccinated, et cetera? And set deadlines to take action. So we're going to have this in place by October 30th. Everyone has to be doubly vaxxed and 2 weeks out. List the available supports for vaccination and include provisions for unvaccinated workers. So those medical exemptions, et cetera, that we talked about, put in place what those are, what's going to apply. Consequences for non-compliance. So do they have to take the course? Do they have to do testing, whatnot? Privacy considerations, how we're going to deal with that, and staff contacts. So who's going to be dealing with it? And once you have those components in place, then let's talk about some of the risks. And for that, I'll turn it back over to Lauren.
Thank you. I think one of the things to bear in mind is this is not a new concept. There have been positions out there that people have had to fulfill and have vaccine requirements that go with them. I can't identify all of them because I don't know what all of them are, but I believe even people who work in childcare, there are certain vaccines that they have to have. So this is not a new concept. It's just a more widespread concept. We're not used to, in many occupations, having to be vaccinated as part of the job because we haven't had this pandemic before. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, in terms of risks, and here we're talking about risks to an employer, I noticed one of the comments in the chat was what would be the outcome if an organization says we need you to get vaccinated and then someone has a reaction. Well, employers aren't responsible for that. That's where the medical screening comes into play when someone is getting vaccinated. So that would take that responsibility away from the organization. Now, in terms of whether or not somebody could sue for constructive dismissal, that one remains a little bit to be seen, but that's where you need to think about what the consequences are going to be and deal with it on a case-by-case basis. There may be circumstances where you're paying a package, but there may be other circumstances, like I mentioned, where we're doing it as a series of education sessions, we're suspending people with pay, and if they still don't comply, at the end of that period, they're being terminated, and that is with cause. So you need to get specific legal advice on your situation, but there are some strategies that you can use that I think would get you to that point at the end of the day. There might also be a human rights complaint that gets filed against employers, but as we've seen, the Human Rights Tribunal has already signaled where they are going to land on this, because human rights needs to be balanced against health and safety. It has always been that way. When we look at the duty to accommodate and what would constitute an undue hardship on an employer to accommodate that person, we always look at health and safety, and that's one of the biggest ones. So nothing operates in a vacuum. You may have this right, somebody else may have that right, and they may intersect, and we have to balance them. So from a human rights perspective, that balancing would happen. I think one of the other risks, though, is things like harassment and conflict in the workplace. As people are getting more and more agitated, we need to cool things down a little bit and try to get people to just be respectful of each other's opinions and decisions, because that is just making our collective mental health suffer because of the anger and the vitriol and the polarity that we're experiencing. We're causing harm to each other. So I think that's one of the risks that we need to think about. But if you're thinking about mental health, it can be psychologically safer to know you're sitting beside somebody who is vaccinated than who isn't. So we have to factor in that in terms of our health and safety equation as well. So what do we do if people are refusing to get vaccinated? We've already talked about that accommodation, but the accommodation can look like many things. So for example, in my workplace, I've already referenced, we have offices, we can close doors, we can do those sort of things. But one of the things an accommodation could mean is to say, look, if you're not vaccinated and it's a day when you need to be here, then you can come in the evening or you can come on weekends, so that you're here at a time when other people aren't here. In some cases, it may mean they continue to work from home, or it may mean that they're having to wear full PPE when perhaps we're at a stage where those who are fully vaccinated are no longer required to. And that will need guidance from public health on, but those are some of the things you can do. So you can look at how we strategize around that. We don't need to just have a one answer. And in fact, my recommendation is that you don't have one single answer, that you look at each one given what is happening, maybe the reason for the reluctance to get vaccinated, what their job is, and how you can protect them. And then also looking at what other measures you have in place. So is discipline an option? So could you discipline people? I think there is precedent for that. And I think that you could. You're just going to have to accompany it with other things. And I think education is going to be an important part of it. Education can be sending somebody to watch a webinar. I think personally, what seems to be most effective is when people are having one-on-one conversations with a medical professional to address some of their specific concerns. We know it's complicated. We know there's a lot of changing information out there because of the nature of the pandemic. And sometimes people just need to hear from somebody they trust, and not, social media, not all the things that we're reading online, which can be very credible and less credible. And so that can be a really helpful measure. And in terms of what employers can do, knowing your legal obligation is important. I think encouraging vaccinations is helpful too. Now we've got incentivize here. The Alberta government, as you may have followed, they did try to do an incentive program. They did a lottery initially. I think it was $1 million. That didn't work. They then said, we're going to give you $100. If you $100 gift card, if you get vaccinated. That didn't work either. And they just landed on, we have to mandate it. So you can try some incentives. You just have to make sure that those that can't get vaccinated because of those human rights accommodation measures aren't being penalized. I will give you an analogy. If you had an attendance policy where people would get a reward for not taking any sick days in a year, but I have to take sick days because I've got a medical condition, then I'm not getting that reward. So you'd have to make sure you provide something that takes that into account. In terms of incentivizing, though, there's other things you can do. What we did as an organization here was to say, if you're getting vaccinated, you get paid time off to do so. If you have a reaction, and many of us did, I know I did, you can have paid time to recover from that, to watch Netflix, to sit there and eat soup or whatever it is, but to feel a little bit better. And I think that helps as well. So we've left a little bit of time for questions. And Rob and I are just going to scroll through, but okay, so I'll answer this question. As a business owner, can I require my employees to take a rapid test twice a week as a condition of employment? How about double vaxxed? I would suggest that you don't necessarily, like, you have to follow public health. So that's the first answer. But certainly as an employer, I think you can ask people to take a rapid test if they are not vaccinated. I'm not sure that's necessarily required if they are. It's a bit of a hassle to do that testing, and you have to make sure that you're maintaining the information in a confidential place. So it's not quite as simple. So you would probably want to limit it. Rob, did you want to answer a question there?
Sure. So there's a question about could it be hard to create a mandate to enforcement, given that there's not conclusive proof that the vaccine doesn't prevent the spread of COVID-19. And it's actually interesting. The CDC introduced something yesterday or earlier this week that said that the spread for people who are vaccinated is actually about 50% less risk of spread than others. So I'm not a medical professional, obviously, so I don't know whether there's any truth to that, but the CDC says that there is significantly less risk of spread. But in terms of whether it could be hard to mandate enforcement, I mean, we're seeing that the law, as it's been adjusted recently, is saying that people have to put in place these mandates, as I mentioned earlier. So I don't think it is going to be hard to enforce it, because there is now that law that says that you have to have those mandates in place. Where there may be some questions is it a reasonable requirement given the situation? So if you're someone who has everyone still working remotely and you challenge it saying there's no reason I should be vaccinated if I'm not interacting with anyone, maybe that's where some people may be able to get some traction.
Thank you, Rob. I also want to speak to the purpose of the vaccines, because I think part of this, a little bit of misunderstandings around the vaccine is that it isn't really designed to stop the spread. That's great. It is helping. What it's really meant to do is to reduce the consequences of getting COVID, so that to reduce death and hospitalization. So sometimes when we look at it, say, oh, but vaccinated people are still getting sick, or at least are getting COVID and maybe are asymptomatic, that means the vaccine's doing its job. So we're not really looking at something that will completely eliminate spread. At this stage, we don't have a vaccine that's doing that, but we do have a successful program of vaccines that are reducing quite significantly hospitalizations and death. So there was a question as well, that the Ontario government is suggesting that you can't ask details about exemptions. So how do we try to enforce it? So this is not new. When it comes to human rights, let's look at disability. So if someone is coming to you and they're asking for some form of accommodation around their job, let's say they have a back injury. I'll just use that as a different example. They're not obligated to tell you what's wrong with them. They only have to tell you what the limitations are through a doctor's note. So the doctor might say, I have this patient, and this patient can't lift more than 20 pounds, can't twist, can't stand for long periods of time. That's the medical information you're entitled to. So you're not entitled to know what the medical exemption is, just that it exists and whether it's permanent or temporary. And that is the stuff that even the OMA, sorry, I lost my acronym there, that the OMA is directing physicians around, that they should be specifying whether it is permanent or temporary. So there are limits on what you can ask for, but it doesn't mean you can't ask for any information. Okay, Rob, over to you.
All right, so someone asked about how CMOH and public health can make it mandatory to have a vaccine policy if that's not in the act or the regulation. And I'm going to go back to what I said earlier on, which is, in fact, it is in the act and regulation, specifically that regulation which the government amended on August 24th. So they actually amended the regulation to say that if you're a business or a person responsible for a business, you have to act in compliance with advice, recommendations, and instructions issued by the CMO. So that actually is in the law now, that you have to comply with it. So yeah, so it is law that you have to comply with it, and that's why they're able to do that.
I'm going to answer a constitutional law question here. Somebody has asked if an employment contract violates the Constitution Act 1982, is it enforceable? So the Constitution, it's really the Charter of Rights that would come into play. The Charter of Rights governs government. It doesn't govern private employers. It's the Human Rights Code that governs employers, most employers in Ontario, unless they're federally regulated. And we've already heard what the federal government is saying. So so you can take that kind of out of the equation. And we've already talked about the Human Rights Commission and the policies that they've released in terms of employer obligations. Remember, Occupational Health and Safety Act is an obligation of employers to protect employees from harm, and being with unvaccinated people does increase that risk of harm. Then we say Human Rights Code, what does that say? How do we balance those two things? We've got those exemptions, but other than that, that health and safety piece is going to come into play. Rob.
So what are the key messages that must be communicated to the employee for their edification and own protection? That's one of the other questions. And I think one of the key things is let them know why you've decided to implement the mandate in the way that you have. So for instance, for people who are working in close quarters with one another in an area where there's a high level of transmission still going around and a lot of people aren't vaccinated, that's where there's often a lot of transmission of it. So you can let the people know, this is why we're doing it this way. This is why we've been doing screening earlier on. We're trying to decrease the risk of people getting infected with one another and to protect you. Like Lauren said earlier on, you do have an obligation as a business owner to protect your employees. And whether or not we're having, I've seen a bunch of comments in the chat about people saying the risk of vaccines worse than the risk of COVID. Whether or not we agree with that, I'm not going to put my opinion out here, but you do have a duty to try to protect your employees, and putting these things in place. The undisputed evidence is that once you have the vaccine, the people getting sick are much less severe consequences, and much fewer people getting sick from once you're vaccinated than people who aren't vaccinated. We have about, I think it's 11 million people in Ontario who are vaccinated, and like Lauren showed, the number of people per 1,000 who are getting COVID is like 1.1 versus 10 per non-vax. So and the numbers are much higher for non-vaccinated, despite there being so many more people who are vaccinated. So the statistics show that if you're vaccinated, you're less likely to get COVID and you're less likely to have severe outcomes. So as an employer, you can say that we're trying to protect your health, and just let them know why you're doing it the way you're doing it. Lauren.
Yes, so somebody's asked a question about face coverings. Are they still mandatory with the new passports coming out? So again, it's whatever public health is recommending. In our workplace, we are 100% fully vaccinated, and we're still wearing masks and making sure we're staying apart. We have the good fortune of having windows that open. We keep them open when we can for ventilation. So we're continuing to abide by the typical health and safety protocols that have been in place since very early on in the pandemic. So making sure that you're just aware as an employer, as an organization, what that public health guidance is. You can't do too much. So having people continue to wear masks isn't going to be a bad thing. It's not going to create greater risk of transmission. So it's not a bad idea to continue to do that.
Someone else asked about the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code does not apply in this situation to employment law matters. Yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not going to go into further detail about it. Lauren, while I'm looking for another one, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, there's a nice quick one, which is should the employer pay? And I think Summer, you indicated that they are available. Now I don't see where that is in the chat. Wellington, here it is. Rapid test kits for Wellington County businesses are available here. So there's a link there. They're available for businesses. Summer, is that free?
Yes, it is. So the Minto Chamber has partnered with the Center Wellington Chamber to provide rapid test kits. We deliver them to Minto businesses. However, they are available to any Wellington County business. If you are not in Wellington County, I would suggest just contacting your public health or local chamber of commerce. They will likely know where you can pick up those test kits for free for businesses.
Yeah, we're in Mississauga and the Mississauga Board of Trade. Same thing. They are distributing them for free. So it's all good.
Yeah, and I know some areas, as long as you have less than 150 workers, there's also free tests that can be gotten through other means. So one of the questions that I've seen is, can unvaccinated employees demand to continue working remotely? And that goes into another question as to what is the employer's entitlement to determine where their employees work. So the quick answer is no, they can't demand it. Well, they can demand it, but they can't successfully demand it and determine where they're going to work. So the employer has the right to determine where the employee is going to work, and they're allowed to say, no, you can't continue working remotely just because you aren't vaccinated.
So this is more of an opinion question, I think, but it's one where I have great empathy for you. But who is protecting the business owner against public lawsuits on discrimination? I think the more case law there is that comes out, like the decisions that have already been released by the Human Rights Tribunal, that will help. But I think it is a challenging time. I will empathize with you on that one. It would have been nice had the government given a little bit more guidance on vaccination for employees. I think that will come because I think there will be more pressure just to give us that information, that reassurance that it's fine. But we don't have that right now, but we have lots of good case law out there. And I do think that at the end of the day, employers will be protected as long as they act reasonably and do what is necessary, but not go beyond that.
I think we have time for one more question, and I want to address the last one here, which is someone said, or it was the second last one, I guess, because a new one just came in. If we continue with our masks, socially distance, and do what we did before, why would we have to mandate the vaccines if everything else remains the same for safety, etc.? So I think what we have to remember is that we're in the fourth wave, we've had multiple waves, and this has had a large effect on people. And I think one of the biggest ones that people have been affected by is the kids. I'm a parent of 3 kids, and we had our kids home from March last year through until September. And that's had a huge effect on kids in general and their socializing, their development, their progress through school. Everything's been affected. And if we have another wave, then it's going to potentially cause another shutdown. And the kids aren't vaccinated. They can't protect themselves the way that other people do. And if people aren't vaccinated, we're not enforcing this, and numbers continue not to rise, then there's going to be more and more cases in schools because people are being exposed. And we're already seeing it. And in the States, there's a flood of kids who are getting sick and being exposed and schools shutting down. And I think there've already been some schools shutting down here. We have to think about everyone, especially the people who can't get vaccinated and our kids. And the only way that we're going to prevent that is by having the people who can get vaccinated. And I don't think anyone wants to shut down again. And I hear the concerns from the small businesses. And really the only way that we're going to protect more people and prevent another shutdown is by continuing to increase the number of people who are vaccinated. So even if you don't like it, to keep your business open, it's probably a good idea to enforce a vaccine mandate regardless of the laws, because it'll increase the numbers. And whether you agree with the government or not, they're saying numbers have to go up in order for us to keep open and keep doing things. So if you want to be able to keep your business running, it's a good idea to have the passport in place and the mandates in place.
And I will, thank you, Rob. I will close with this idea, because we are hearing a lot about people talking about my rights, my rights, my rights, but our rights are always accompanied by responsibilities. And we have rights, we have responsibilities to others as well. And that dovetails to what Rob is saying. So this isn't just about my right, it's about what's the implication of my decision for other people. And that's been part of our law for a very long time, probably forever, that it's like when our kids are growing up and, you know, I want this, okay, but that right or that privilege comes with some responsibility as well. And so that's really what we're trying to look at. The law balances our rights, which we have, with our responsibilities, which we also have. So thank you very much for joining us today. I know it's complicated. I know we're exhausted by all of the change and all of the challenges and all of the information and misinformation that's out there. But hopefully this session has given you a few more answers. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much to Lauren and Rob for imparting their knowledge on all of us and walking us through this. I think you cleared up a lot of questions and answered a lot for our attendees. Thanks to everyone for attending. And prior, I forgot to welcome Derek, for the Town of Minto CAO. He was on the call earlier just to welcome everyone, and it slipped my mind on a Monday morning. So thanks to Derek for joining us. We appreciate it. Just really quickly, I wanted to give a little plug for some upcoming Launch It training sessions. There's one September 20th from 11 till 12:30, how to raise your rates. There's a two-part one on advertising on Facebook, October 20th and 27th. And then for the month of October, we've partnered with the Business Center Guelph Wellington to offer 31-hour free sessions to businesses of all industries and walks. So just hop on our website, either the Chamber or Launch It, and you can find all those sessions. Facebook page has them all in the events as well. So thank you again. And if anyone has any follow-up questions or more questions on the Rapid Test Kit program for Wellington County businesses, reach out to myself, info@mintochamber.on.ca, and I can certainly help you out. But thanks again.
Thank you. Take care.